has been a absolutely crazy week. For those of you who are based in Sydney, I would love to just say congratulations on the summer weather. Even though we're in autumn, it certainly has been a scorcher this week. So I hope you've all been able to get out and about and enjoy some of the sunshine. It certainly will start to turn cooler as this weekend approaches. Now, wonderful for you all to reach out with your questions. And thanks again to everyone who does so. I really appreciate those. It gives me a reason to have these sessions with you on a weekly basis. So keep them coming. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw some comments below. Now, a lot of questions came out this week around on-premise servers. Now, I appreciate that this is something that is a varied answer, especially dependent on the size of your organization. But please allow me to try and break some of these down because I have had a number of you reach out about this. Now, SMEs. Do I need an on-premise server? I would have to say there is a very little opportunity unless you have a customized application for you to utilize an on-premise server. There are a lot of complications that it adds when you do have an on-premise server. There are some serious concerns around security management, backup, etc. So for an SME, and we're talking about organizations sub 20 or so, do the cloud options out there give you options to potentially utilize that better than an on-premise? Absolutely. Are there cost benefits to using the cloud? They vary. And I mean, on-premise server can be cheaper, but you have other considerations that can add to that. And that includes power, that includes cooling, that includes storage. So keep those in mind when you are starting to look at commercials, because it isn't just about buying kit and then hosting it in your offices. Now, for a mid-enterprise, there are quite a considerable amount of mid-enterprises we've worked with, and I have, that do still have custom applications, custom requirements, storage, and of course, being able to connect and authenticate devices. Yes, there are like cloud-based authentication applications. We talked about Intune last week, Microsoft Intune, of course. We have talked about Azure AD in the previous sessions, which allows for devices within an organization to be connected and authenticated to your tenancy. But there is also benefits, pros and cons to everything. So when you're looking at those decision-making, especially when you start talking about mid-enterprise, you are starting to talk about storage. Now, cloud storage, unfortunately, is not linear. It is not a cost that is consistent every single month. When you start to talk about storage, you're talking about a growth. Now, a growth pattern for average storage capacity is around 30% year on year. So if you're thinking about the figure 1, your organization has, say, 1 terabyte of storage, which is quite small. You could see that grow by 30% at the end of year 1. But again, at 1.3, you're going to see a 30% increase again on that the next following year, which means the growth and the costs will always escalate. So mid-enterprise organizations certainly try to maintain that and cap those costs by utilizing in-premise or on-premise or data center-driven storage capacity. And it's the same thing you'll see in enterprises, especially around security, because the ability to actually keep the costs down, one, security by able to monitor and manage the infrastructure is certainly one of the considerations, but also having an internal team to be able to support that. So the questions are quite different for every organization, different for every industry, especially when we're talking about some of the most regulated industries, FSI, energy production, for example. These are some of the considerations around compliance with your regulatory bodies and auditors, for example. So there's a lot of variables when we start talking about this. So I appreciate that a couple of you have reached out around it. And may I say thank you for that. And I'd love to chat to you further around what that means for your organization. If you'd like, feel free to reach out. Obviously, again, every organization, both in size and industry, will vary for these. So going back, we talked about Intune last week. So thank you very much for reaching out. And one of the things that brought up by this topic around Intune was around security and whether or not your posture is, let's call it secure enough, or is it something that you should be considering? Now, I keep saying this to, I guess, the broader audience. Cybersecurity is like going to the gym. You need to keep going so you get a regular outcome. You can't just expect to go to the gym once, run on the treadmill, and then be able to go do a marathon the next week. Cybersecurity is literally like a marathon. It is something you need to hop on the treadmill regularly, review, revisit, and make sure you're keeping on top of that. one of the reasons is now you're going to see a lot more requirements for boards, managers, etc., to keep an eye on these, as well as being able to report on your activity for your cybersecurity. That includes, for example, your cyber insurance, and that is something that's becoming more and more common within organisations. Now, having a chat with quite a number of people who do that, there are only around a handful of insurers in Australia that offer cyber insurance, and we're talking around up to 9 at the moment. So it's not a large volume of those who offer it in Australia. However, having said that, cyber insurance policies, cybersecurity and cyber insurance policies can start from as little as 1,500 per annum. And that's talking about an organisation with around 20 seats. So that is certainly something that's critical. But to reduce and to keep those costs down, you do need to apply categories and controls for your security to be able to meet, for example, Essential 8 standard, say, maturity level 1. So do you keep up with that on a regular basis? There should be cadence on that. So you should be reviewing it, if not monthly, at least once a week, if not daily. And so that way you are making sure that you are keeping the best possible way to avoid your organisation being breached. One of the key factors around this, especially for SMEs, is apply multi-factor authentication. Again, only 30% of Australian organisations statistically show uses MFA on every application. There are such services out there as single sign-on, which means that you can authenticate applications using algorithmic characters instead from a centralized point, and it's similar to our password manager, but it's organization-wide. So please keep that in mind. Now, I have a special guest who's popped in today, lovely Pheobe Gho. Hi, Phoebe. Welcome. How are you doing?
Hello, it's so good to see you. How are you
Oh,
doing?
pleasure's all mine. And you know what? We did this as a bit of surprise live chat, didn't we?
It's always nice. I mean, given that I'm on the other side of the world, it's so super cool that I can be there in person.
Yeah, and I love how that we can pop in. Now, Phoebe, you and I have had a number of conversations recently, and these are broad and extensive, and the word cloud seems to pop up everywhere, right? And look, I did start on the chat earlier about what cloud means to an organization, but one of the key factors around the cloud, and this is something that we've probably seen more prominently, is the cloud is shared infrastructure. That's really where it started from. It was a marketing term that Microsoft threw quite a considerable amount of funds behind, and nothing more than a bunch of servers that are shared across a platform. And one of the key drivers in this happens to have a big V at the beginning of their name. Sound familiar?
Well, I would say that that cloud I mean, shared infrastructure. You said it. It's been around. We have popularized it in the public cloud, the hyperscalers, this massive, scalability and growth. But VMware has been building what I would consider clouds, or customers have been using VMware to build clouds for a really long time, over
Yeah.
25 years, I think. So yeah, cloud has been around.
And look, and it's an interesting point. I mean, you and I spoke about this a number of times, and cloud is nothing new. But one of the key parts of the cloud that has always been a concern for us is you get caught up in a roadmap, right? In a vendor's roadmap. And this is something that many organizations are now facing, the grim reality of being caught up in one particular vendor's roadmap. And we're talking about VMware, right? And VMware has been a fantastic platform. Virtualization isn't new. Mainframe systems were doing these in the 1960s. Sorry, nothing new. It just got coined in a different term. And x86, or that sort of infrastructure, is basically where VMware took off. Now, as Broadcom has acquired VMware, they've changed the pricing structure.
Yeah.
Not surprising. And in so doing, removed certain amounts of programs. Again, not surprising. Taken away annualization subscriptions and replaced those with monthly. But in so doing, has also increased costs. So, is this the first time you think that this will happen?
No, that you're putting me on the spot. We know that this is the model that is businesses, vendors are kind of saying, hey, subscriptions are kind of the way to go. We see it in day to day. It's not, my iPhone has probably more subscriptions on it now than I would ever have had for the last 10 years. Now it's all just on my iPhone. Every month I'm getting billed. We're seeing that come into the enterprise. We're seeing that come to business, and it's no surprise. We may not love that, but that's just kind of the way that we do see a lot of vendors going down that path, and we're needing, customers, we're all needing to adjust, I think, to that model.
And do you know what? An interesting point for you. Obviously we're talking about technology, but the technology services as a subscription model doesn't just live within the infrastructure space. Vehicles, as an example. Now, my colleague has a Mercedes Benz and has had the vehicle for 5 years, and then all of a sudden, for 4 years, and then all of a sudden he's told that he has to pay for these subscription services moving forward, including remote start, remote lock. And so you're absolutely bang on. Having said that, this unfortunate scenario that a lot of organizations are in is because you are on a specific roadmap, in this case, a virtualization platform, they're now locked to that, and their options and the view, may I say, is that you're stuck.
Yeah.
Is that a fair word?
That's what I think. As a consumer, I think there's a better way for companies to do it than to just like switch it like a light bulb and say, hey, you got to pay subscriptions now, because we are used to, we have things like budgets, we have plans, we have strategies, and to just kind of what it feels like is you kind of done a bit of a, oh, I thought I bought something and now I've got something else. So that's really tough. I think that's the first thing to acknowledge, is that this is it's the suddenness, or at least the unexpectedness. It feels like almost of the show. What was working is working really well, and suddenly you're changing things. It can be really tough and uncomfortable. So I think that's the first thing to acknowledge, is that, hey, we see that, we know that that's the case, and maybe let's try and take the emotion out of it and go, okay, what's the strategy? What are the best options that we have moving forward? So I think that's the first thing I just wanted to say. But yeah, it's I forgot the question you asked. The joys of live.
That's okay. And look, you make so many valid points about this. When we start to talk about it, I mean, you are US based. US organizations are predominantly cloud driven, right? I mean, we see that, and it's statistically shown there are a lot more propensity to utilize cloud.
I mean, it varies. I mean, I think that the thing that I've noticed the most moving over here from Australia is just how big this market is, how many types of different customers, I mean, how many types of different organizations, their needs, their requirements. At the end of the day, what are we all trying to do? We're all trying to move faster. We're all trying to do things in a secure way. We're all trying to do things as cost efficiently as possible. So, I mean, I think that even though there are a lot of cloud consumers, there's also a lot of customers in the boat of, I'm not ready. I'm not ready for this public cloud thing yet. But I'm not sure what my options are, because it felt like, everything was just tossed in the air, right?
And that's exactly the point. And when we start to talk about this, well, let's take one step back, right? We talked about what is cloud as a definition. I mean, we understand that, but then we start to talk about what is it that you need from the cloud.
Yeah.
And then the next point about that is, we've gone from what we would call click ops, and that's doing everything manually, updating applications manually, updating installations, etc., all done through a human person actually doing that. Now to the next level of operations, where we would call it infrastructure as code. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think of it as a cloud maturity scale. I call it a cloud maturity scale, but it's not necessarily like your maturity into the cloud. It's your maturity of all of the supporting services that cloud requires, your skills. You said automation, infrastructure as code, whether you have the security and the understanding of all the compliance requirements of where your data lives. And so I think of this cloud maturity model as being partially about am I ready to adopt the technology? Also, am I ready to adopt the technologies that make cloud, the most effective? So automation and cloud, and kind of some of the tool sets that, serverless and things like that make cloud super, super exciting. And even starting to use some of those newer technologies like AI that are in the cloud ready to consume, right? Like, versus having to build it yourself. So I think of this kind of almost a scale or a grid maybe of like, how cloud mature am I as an organization and my people, and what do I need to build on before I feel like I've got those right skill sets? So that's kind of how I see it, that these are all just pieces of a puzzle. But the one that we always think about is the infrastructure one. Like it's it's the big obvious one.
It's the
You need
underlying baker, right? You know,
right,
we've got to get ground floor ready.
right, exactly. It's like you
But
can't put the ceiling on before the walls are up.
hold on, we haven't poured the cement. Yeah, but it's an interesting concept because when we talk about like the change in the way infrastructure led, let's call it the whole technology discussion in the late 90s, 2000s, etc. Then we moved to applications, and applications were king, right? SaaS products, etc. And now we've moved to data, where data is the new oil. And, essentially the newest marketing conversation is around how do you know where your data is? And to your point, right, knowing where your data is obviously around the governance, etc. But if we talk about that and we work in reverse, data was always described, right? It's an understanding of what data is, where it lives, and how to manage it. And then we started to look at applications being deployed similarly, right? We're going to deploy applications as code. We're going to describe everything so that when we need to deploy this on scale, we can do so. And that's starting to happen. And then the next level of evolution, and we talked about how it went up to data and now it's come back down, right? So we're now at that point where infrastructure can now be described as code, but that starts to be cloud native. And I mean the word cloud native. Why? Because it can scale, right?
Yeah. That's a cool way of looking at it, and I like that a lot, because we are now able. It's not about the infrastructure as much as it is about the data, but you need the infrastructure in the right places, and you need it at the right time to take advantage of all of that data, to get the insights and to be able to do all the things you want to do, analytics and so on. So they're kind of tied and related to each other, and they have to, it's really cool to see that, and I love that description of it. We need to have the right skill sets in each of those places to be able to take advantage of them. And sometimes the skill set is people, and sometimes it's technology, and it's a combination of both.
And it's an interesting point. You made it a really interesting point, skill sets. And you and I, when we had this brief discussion, was around education, right? I mean,
I love this topic. I think this is why you do this podcast. You want to educate people. I totally appreciate it.
Absolutely. But when we talk about education, okay, humans are resistant to change. And as we've seen through program deliveries, we obviously need to bring people on the bus. And the same concept can be applied here when we're talking about skilling up in regards to what the technologies are. So yes, VMware as a technology, that has now been embedded for near on 20 years. I'm showing my age here and my grey hairs. Being an ex-VMware.
I don't see him.
Thanks. I do amazing things on the video. But being an ex-VMware engineer myself, I understand that, because you obviously went from that shift of one server per hardware using a Microsoft operating system or a Linux operating system, to then having to understand that the hypervisor and the tooling, etc., behind it. So the next evolution is obviously education around moving from that to infrastructure as code, right? And when we start to talk about that, and as a baseline technology, we talk about Kubernetes. That's that evolution, right?
I would definitely see that. Like if I look at we went from mainframes, you mentioned that earlier, to kind of more bare metal servers, and then to VMs, and now we're kind of looking at that next layer, which is containers, and Kubernetes is probably the most popular orchestrator of those containers, because it's got a huge community behind it. You got lots of companies, enterprise vendors supporting it. You've got partners like yourself, like ASE, who are able to help make that process easier. So it's definitely I'd say for a lot of organizations, it's either the digital transformation destination, at least from an infrastructure perspective, or it's or they're already there. They're starting that journey, and they're starting to build new applications in containers, as well as refactoring old ones, for sure.
Yeah, and you make a really interesting point about that. So refactoring is probably one of the reasons why organizations stay where they are, right? Because the cost constraints behind it, the skilling to upgrade. One of the factors, I guess, I'd like to educate is you don't have to constantly refactor. You can repurpose but not refactor, right? And this is one of the reasons why, yes, VMware is certainly an amazing product, but you don't need to refactor it. You can repurpose those on alternative cloud native platforms, right? And we talk about that. One of the examples is in NetApp's Blue XP, right? I mean, the native tooling behind that, for example, is Fluid. You guys can certainly utilize that. And there are other alternatives out there. There is there's no limit to that. The reason being is that, I mean, one of the advocacies I like to talk about is open source, right? And that's probably one of the biggest things that we've seen shift from, that kind of paradigm where Microsoft owned code to even now they're being a bit more of a part of the open source community, is because of the fact that the community has grown. And you said it, right? Kubernetes has a huge community. In fact, one of the key factors is that you will see us at Kubecon in Paris next week.
Oh, you're gonna be there! I'm so jealous.
Yeah.
I would love to be in Paris. I'm hoping I will be at KubeCon in North America later in the year. But yeah, definitely, I would say that's a great opportunity to meet some of those. I mean, I think some of the most advanced organizations that we've spoken to at NetApp are in Europe. So and I know they'll all be there. So that's awesome. Hey, I wanted to say something. I wanted to kind of go back to what you said about like how do I get from this VM to container world? I hear this conversation a lot, and I want to kind of touch on that because I think I mean, obviously some applications can be refactored, others are a little bit harder. They need vendor support and other sorts of things. But I think there's a step before that we should all kind of look at, which is, should it be refactored? And now I'm looking at there are open source tools, and there are obviously other ways of running virtualization, running VMs in containers or as containers, alongside containers. So I think there's technology-wise, there's actually a lot of options. And so I think the biggest thing to do before you even, I'm a techie, so I really want to dive into the how, but it's the should I, and going back to kind of looking at, do I keep these applications? Do I keep them in VMs for a bit? Do I re-platform them so that running alongside containers? Do I rebuild them as containers, or do I just wait till I can rebuild the whole thing and actually build an actually cloud native application, which a lot of them are going to go down that path too. And so stopping and going, hey, there are 4 options, there's ways to do this, helps kind of take some of that like panic out of the, I have to go to containers because that's the thing to do. Like, it's not I'm a technical person, so I really want to say containers are the answer to everything. They're not.
No.
And so there's a lot of those great options, and I think it's tools, exactly like you said, like Fluid inside Blue XP, inside NetApp's Blue XP, that help make that, once you've made that decision of, okay, I'm going to do something with this app, it just simplifies that whole. That to me is the dream. Is to say, okay, I've made a decision where I want to go. Hey, look, my data infrastructure and my tool sets support that decision. And no matter what I choose, I've got the right answer. And it's ideally, a piece of code or a click away, that kind of thing. It's not a learning curve of like, oh, I've got to go learn this whole brand new technology stack. I think there's a lot of great tools out there that can help you on that journey.
Yeah, and you make a really valid point, right? It's about the strategy. Set the strategy. Understand that. I mean, hip shot changes.
Sound like fun.
Yeah, they can be. I mean, if you're in the Wild West, look at which wild. But unfortunately, when you're talking about technology, they are costly, right? And so, when you set a strategy, absolutely. I mean, I would say this acquisition by Broadcom has certainly thrown a lot of people's strategies into a bit of disarray, right? Because their budgets were probably expecting X amount of cost per licensing. And, and it's going to be an inconvenience. You're absolutely spot on, right? But having a dynamic strategy means that you can actually lean on partners, like you said, like ourselves, like NetApp, like there are like endless partners out there in the industry. And that's the point where you've got to start going, okay, cool. This is a curveball. I can have a look at an ROI that could potentially change how I address this strategy. And let's do that as a collective bunch, right? And you talk about things like that. talk about education. How do I then bring my staff on the journey so that I can make sure that if we do go down this path, they're not left behind?
Yeah.
And we're talking about, who are my partners that I want a strategy with? Is it a public cloud provider that we feel that we may do? Do I need to consider bringing this cloud native platform internally, right? I mean, cloud repatriation, it's a term that's got so much momentum. I mean, there's a ton of organizations that I could publicly list that literally show their P&Ls going from like this on cost for IT to down like this when they brought the infrastructure back, because it is an ever exponential growth, right? I mean, storage in the cloud is constant and it's a cost, and everyone needs to recognize it will not linear. It won't stay linear. It will always have increase. In fact, I did say the average statistic, and this is for an organization, is 30% growth year on year for your data. And that's a quite like linear amount. I mean, you've seen this more than I would, Phoebe. I mean, feel free to comment.
Yeah, well, yep, absolutely. I think 30% is probably on the average. Like I think that many companies grow a lot more than that. Another stat for you that I don't know, it might kind of put it into perspective, especially if you're paying for it, on a recurring monthly bill. 68% of it is probably never going to be touched again after you create it. That's cold data. It's data that we create, we store. Maybe we can't delete it. It's a record, but nobody's going to look at it for a very long time, or if at all, they need it. So it's about sensibly storing those kinds of data sets, the growing data sets, and the different, I guess, personalities, the different needs for those data sets as well. And whether those belong on premises, because, hey, that's a more manageable expense. I can plan for that. I know how it's going to grow, as opposed to the cloud where things change a lot. That I think is a really it's a good discussion to have internally. Storage is not just storage. There's different types of storage, different types of data. So yeah, that's a big one for us. Yeah, we see that a lot.
Where data lives, how you protect it, how you govern it, how you back it up.
Yeah, all that stuff too. Do you want to protect it? you might be growing at 30%, but like, how many copies of it, how many locations do you have to hold it in to make sure that you're meeting all your regulatory requirements and so on?
Oh goodness, that's enough to scare the living daylights out of most people.
But there's solutions. I think that's the nice thing. I mean, that's why I think why you and I can laugh about it a little bit, is because we know and we've seen ways that customers are solving this, the way that you can manage those costs, and you can make them a little bit less, like, you're not going to get that bill shock at the end of the month.
So, I mean, look, I appreciate that. Obviously, we've gone through a number of really deep and dense conversations. And thank you so much to everyone who has written in on those topics. So please feel free to reach out. Phoebe you'll be able to see with her, I'm going to link on the content above. So I will have that in LinkedIn, so you can reach out and ask any questions. Phoebe, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. I know it's late over there, so really massive thank you.
No, thank you so much. These, like you said, we go through so much every single time we chat. And it's always so much fun.
I love it. And it's really, I mean, it's a melding of the minds, but it's also because we have completely different communities we work with. And so that's one of the reasons why I love it, is because we get different perception. I mean, obviously, as I said, in Australia, our organisation set is majority SMEs, SMBs. So you've got that, right? Talking 80% of that. And in Europe and in Americas, they're quite a different subset of organisations. So really lovely to hear the differences between us. And so thank you very much for joining us. Now, as always, people like to say, think before you click. There is definitely more reasons to be concerned. I've certainly seen there has been statistics about how much scam instances have changed. And to your point, Phoebe, you spoke about this. AI, unfortunately, is making scamming and cybersecurity far more, let's call it mainstream and believable, is actually probably the worst part. We'll go into a different one on that at a future date, because there is a lot of questions around that. And we talked around, I don't want to get into this because it is a rabbit warrant that we could get down for a very long time. Again, thank you, Phoebe, for joining us. I really appreciate your insights as always, and I look forward to our next one.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to answer any questions, and let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. And until we see you next time, everyone, feel free to reach out and stay safe online, and we will talk to you very soon.